9 minutes before First Claw Vesic lost his entire boarding team, he told his second-in-command that the human ship ahead of them was already dead. It just hadn't stopped moving yet. The vessel drifted at the edge of the debris field, engines dark, hull scorched along one flank where a SK-30 rail slug had opened it like a tin can. No return fire. No power signature beyond a faint hum in the aft section. By every measure the hegemony sensors could take, the ship, designated by human registry as the Meridian Line, was a corpse waiting to be looted. Vesic had boarded 11 wrecks in his career. He expected this to be the 12th. He was wrong, and the reason he was wrong was the same reason the hegemony had been quietly losing this war for 6 months without admitting it to itself. Somewhere in the last quiet moments before the airlock cycled open, a scanner reading he chose not to question would decide which of his soldiers walked back out. He did not know that yet. He would know it within the hour, and by then it would already be far too late to matter. The battle that put the Meridian Line here had gone exactly the way every battle against humans was supposed to go. SK-30 doctrine was built on one unshakable principle, drilled into every cadet from birth. Never let the enemy get close. 100 conquered worlds had fallen to that principle. Rail cannons that could put a slug through a hull from 400,000 kilometers. Particle lances that traced clean, surgical lines across a target before the target's crew even registered the launch flash. Drone swarms that swept ahead of the main fleet like a net, so that anything capable of closing distance died before it got the chance. It was, by any reasonable military logic, a superior way to fight. Why risk a soldier's life in a corridor when you could end an enemy from a distance so vast the enemy never even saw who killed them? Against the Calvex remnant, against the Thren Compact, against a dozen other species who had tried and failed to stand against the hegemony, the doctrine had worked precisely as designed. Those species valued their soldiers. They valued survival. When the numbers turned against them, they retreated, regrouped, sued for terms. War was, to them as to the SK-30, a calculation. You fought until the cost outweighed the gain, and then you stopped. Humans did not seem to understand this. The first engagements against the human colonial fleets had gone well for the hegemony, at least on paper. Ship for ship, at range, human vessels lost badly. Their weapons were unrefined by SK-30 standards, short-burn plasma cutters that lost cohesion past a few thousand kilometers, kinetic clusters that scattered like shotgun pellets instead of tracking cleanly to a point. SK-30 war analysts reviewing the early combat logs had used words like primitive and crude. One junior officer, in a report that would later be quoted derisively in 100 command briefings, wrote that human weapons technology seemed to have skipped several essential stages of development. There had been a dissenting voice, though not a loud one. A logistics officer named Threll had noted, in a footnote nobody above her pay grade ever read, that cargo manifests recovered from a captured human supply ship carried an unusual ratio. For every unit of long-range ordnance, the humans stockpiled nearly 9 units of close-quarters equipment. 9-1. Threll flagged it as a curiosity, possibly a supply chain inefficiency, and moved on to the next line item. Nobody followed up. The War Council had more pressing matters: territory to secure, tribute to collect, 100 smaller campaigns running across 100 conquered systems. A footnote about ammunition ratios did not seem worth anyone's attention. What none of them asked in those early months was why a species capable of interstellar travel, capable of fusion drives and quantum communication arrays, would design their weapons that way on purpose. It would have been a simple question. It would have saved a great many lives to have asked it sooner. Vesic had asked. It was why he was still alive to be confused about it now. The boarding shuttle docked against the Meridian Line's starboard airlock with a shudder that Vesic felt through the soles of his boots. 6 soldiers behind him, plus second Rill at his shoulder. A solid team, experienced, the kind of unit you sent when a wreck was valuable enough to be worth claiming instead of simply cataloging. And the Meridian Line was valuable. Sensor sweeps had flagged an intact command core, still faintly powered, along with cargo holds registering mass signatures consistent with refined ore. A salvage prize and possibly intelligence, command cores sometimes held navigational data, fleet dispositions, things worth more than the ship itself. Life signs? Rill asked as the airlock cycled. 2, Vesic said, reading the scanner clipped to his forearm. Deep in the ship. Could be crew who didn't make it to the escape pods. Could be automated systems throwing false positives. He didn't think it was false positives. Human ships didn't usually throw false positives. Their systems were annoyingly precise, in the same way their weapons were annoyingly imprecise. It was one of 100 small contradictions about the species that nobody in SK-Theory Command had bothered to reconcile into a coherent picture. Behind him, one of the younger soldiers, a soft-scaled recruit named Dessa on her first live boarding, asked Rill in a low voice whether the two life signs might be worth taking alive. Intelligence value, she said. Command would want prisoners to interrogate. Rill told her not to get ahead of the mission. Vesic said nothing, but he filed the exchange away because it would matter later, because Dessa's question assumed a fight that could be paused, negotiated, walked back from, and nothing about what waited in that ship would allow for any of that. The airlock hissed open onto darkness. SK-Theory eyes adjusted quickly. An evolutionary gift from a homeworld with long twilight seasons, and the corridor beyond resolved into gray shapes. Conduit runs along the ceiling, handholds bolted to the walls at intervals that suggested the designers had expected zero-gravity emergencies. Doorways spaced closer together than SK-Theory architecture favored. Human ships always felt cramped to Vesic. Efficient, but cramped, like the species didn't trust open space the way his own people did. He didn't know yet that the cramped corridors weren't an oversight. They were the point. Spread standard formation, he said. Rill, take point on the scanner. We move to the command core first, cargo second. The team advanced in practice silence, weapons, long-barreled particle carbines, built for range even here, out of habit as much as doctrine, held low and ready. The ship groaned around them, the settling sounds of a dying hull. Twice they passed sealed doors that the scanner flagged as having atmosphere behind them. Twice Vesic ordered the team past without opening them. Priorities. Command core first. It was the third door that changed things, though none of them knew it yet. The door was marked, in human script that the team's translation overlay rendered as a word meaning roughly armory. Restricted. Standard salvage procedure called for a look. Rill breached it with practiced efficiency, cutting the lock and stepping back to let two soldiers sweep the room. It was empty of crew. But it was not empty. Racked along the walls, in numbers that made no sense for the ship's registered crew complement of 40, were weapons unlike anything in the combat logs Vesic had studied. Not the long, elegant carbines his own people favored. These were short, absurdly short barrel lengths that SK-Theory engineering would have rejected in the design phase for sacrificing range beyond any reasonable use case. Thick-gauge shotguns loaded with something that gleamed faintly, depleted metal flechettes packed into shells the size of a SK-Theory thumb. Blades, actual edged blades, a technology Vesic's people had abandoned in their own military doctrine millennia ago, mounted alongside firearms as though the humans considered them equally serious tools of war. Explain this, Rill said, turning one of the shotguns over in gloved claws. Vesic didn't have an explanation. What he had was a bad feeling, the kind that had kept him alive through 11 previous boardings. A small, cold certainty that a ship this crippled should not still have this many working weapons racked and ready, unless someone had left them that way on purpose. He looked at the rack again. The shotguns weren't stored for transport. They were stored for access. Muzzles out, grips forward, spaced for a hand to close around one without slowing down to think. Rill, he said. This isn't a supply room. This is a staging point. He was still working out what that meant when the lights came on. Not battle lights. Not alarms. Ordinary white illumination, flooding the corridor in a way that made every SK-Theory soldier's photoreceptors clench painfully against the sudden brightness, because their eyes were built for twilight, for distance, for scanning wide dim horizons, not for close bright spaces designed by a species whose eyes worked entirely differently. It was a 2-second disadvantage. It was enough. The first human came through a side hatch that hadn't registered on the scanner as an access point, because it wasn't one, not officially, just a maintenance crawlspace repurposed with an ambush in mind, and closed the distance to the nearest soldier before anyone's carbine had finished tracking. He didn't fire from range. He didn't need to. The blade in his hand, one of the racked weapons from a room deeper in the ship, Vesic would realize later, one of dozens identical to what they'd just found, went into the gap between armor plates at the soldier's throat, and the soldier went down without getting off a shot. Vesek's carbine was built to put a particle bolt through a target 400 meters away with pinpoint accuracy. At 4 meters in a corridor 8 meters wide, half of its targeting assist was useless. It kept trying to compensate for a range that didn't exist. He fired anyway, caught a second human in the shoulder, watched her stagger and keep coming. That was the detail that would haunt him afterward, retelling this to the War Council. She kept coming. A wound that should have ended the engagement, by any SK theory calculation of cost versus continuation, didn't slow her down at all. The shotgun she carried didn't need range. At the distance she closed to, it didn't need accuracy either. The pattern of flechettes it threw didn't have to be aimed so much as pointed, and pointed was enough. Rill went down. Then the soldier beside him. The corridor, which had felt spacious a minute ago, was suddenly the worst possible place in the universe for a species whose entire military philosophy assumed the fight would never get this close. Somewhere behind him, Dessa was screaming Rill's name, and then she wasn't screaming anything at all, and Vesek understood with a clarity that felt almost physical that the two stragglers his sensors had flagged were never going to run. Every choice they were making, the crawlspace ambush, the timed lights, the racked weapons kept close at hand instead of secured, was the choice of someone who had already decided how this encounter was going to end, and had simply been waiting for the SK theory to walk into the room where it would happen. Vesek retreated. It was not a decision so much as an instinct that overrode every doctrine he'd ever been trained in, doctrine that had never anticipated needing a plan for this because SK theory doctrine's entire purpose was to make sure this never happened. He fell back through the armory, through the corridor beyond, firing wild shots that his carbine's targeting systems flagged, uselessly as target range, insufficient for optimal accuracy. Behind him, he heard Rill's voice cut off mid-shout. Then nothing from Rill at all. He counted afterward, much later, in the debrief he gave with his claws still shaking, that the engagement, beginning to end, first shot to his own retreat back through the airlock, had lasted under 90 seconds. Of the 7 soldiers who had boarded the Meridian line, 1 made it back to the shuttle. The War Council did not believe him at first. That was, in its way, the most dangerous part of the entire encounter. More dangerous than the ambush itself, because an enemy tactic you refuse to believe in is a tactic you can never counter. Vesek stood before 11 senior officers in a chamber built, like everything SK theory, for open sight lines and comfortable distance between speaker and audience, and told them that a boarding party of 7 experienced soldiers had been effectively destroyed by what appeared to be 2, possibly 3, human survivors on a ship the hegemony's own weapons had already crippled. Their vessel was disabled, said Fleet Marshal Karath, an officer whose career had been built on 40 years of textbook victories at range. Their crew was reduced to escape pod evacuees and stragglers. You are telling this council that stragglers defeated a trained boarding team. I am telling this council, Vesek said, that we do not understand what we are fighting. He requested the analysis team pull the recovered sensor logs from his own suit, logs that had kept recording even after he'd stopped thinking clearly enough to review them himself, and project the armory room onto the chamber's display. Rack after rack of short-barreled weapons, blades, armor that SK theory scanners had initially misclassified as decorative because it was so much heavier and more restrictive than anything a species built for mobility should reasonably wear, except it wasn't built for mobility. It was built to survive being stabbed, shot, or struck at a range SK theory engineers had never designed a single weapon or piece of armor to account for. Every human weapon we have catalogued from long-range engagements, Vesek said, has been, by our standards, inferior, imprecise, short-ranged even for what it is. We assumed this reflected a species behind us in military development. He let the silence sit for a moment before continuing. It does not. It reflects a species that never intended to fight the war we thought we were fighting. One of the younger council members, an officer who had served under Vesek's own command a decade earlier, asked the question that would eventually reshape the hegemony's entire war footing. If they build for close range on purpose, she said, then every crippled ship we leave adrift, every hull we assume is a safe salvage target, is a trap we are choosing to walk into. We have been treating their wrecks as prizes. What if they have been treating their wrecks as bait? The chamber went quiet in a way that Vesek recognized, the particular silence of a room full of officers realizing, all at once, that a war they believed they were winning had rules they had never bothered to learn. Karath's skepticism did not move. A civilization does not choose to be weak at range. They are not weak at range, Vesic said. They simply do not care about it. Every human weapon we recovered from that ship was optimized for one purpose and one purpose only, to guarantee, absolutely, that anyone within arm's reach of the wielder does not survive the encounter. Not to wound, not to suppress, not to deter. To end it permanently the first time, regardless of the cost to the person holding the weapon. He described the soldier who had taken a particle bolt to the shoulder and kept advancing. He watched several officers in the chamber shift in their seats, the specific discomfort of soldiers confronting a fact their training had no framework for. We build our weapons, Vesic continued, around the assumption that we will always have the choice to disengage, that range is safety, and safety is the point. Humans built theirs around the opposite assumption, that the fight will happen close, and it will happen on the worst possible terms, and the only thing that matters is that it ends in their favor when it does. They did not build for distance because they never intended to rely on it. It took the analysis division 3 more weeks, and the loss of 2 more boarding parties on 2 other crippled human vessels. Losses the Council authorized against Vesic's direct recommendation, because doctrine took longer to unlearn than a single testimony could manage, before the pattern was accepted as more than one officer's shaken account. The second loss was the one that finally moved Karaith. A cruiser called the Ashgrove Reach, gutted by rail fire and left tumbling with no active engines, no visible weapon signature, and, by every scan the hegemony could run, no meaningful crew remaining. Karaith authorized the boarding personally, partly to prove Vesic wrong. Of the 9 soldiers sent aboard, 3 came back. The survivors' accounts matched Vesic's testimony almost line for line. Close ambush, weapons that didn't care about accuracy because accuracy was never the point at 4 meters, a fight that ended in under 2 minutes because the humans had never intended for it to last longer than that. Karaith read the debrief twice, in silence, and then ordered every fleet in the sector to stop boarding disabled human vessels until new doctrine was written. The pieces, once assembled, formed an uncomfortable picture. Human military history, it turned out, was not a story of steady technological escalation toward ever greater standoff range, the way SK-theory history had unfolded. It was a story that kept circling back, generation after generation, to close, brutal, decisive violence. Conflicts fought in trenches, in city blocks, in stairwells and tunnels and rooms too small to retreat from. Even as human technology raced ahead in every other domain, the species had never fully abandoned the idea that some fights had to be finished up close, and that when they were, hesitation killed more people than commitment did. The SK-theory doctrine of distance had been built across centuries of wars against species who, like the hegemony itself, treated combat as a calculation to be won efficiently and abandoned once the cost outweighed the gain. It was a doctrine that worked beautifully against an enemy who wanted, above all, to survive. It had no answer for an enemy who had built their entire arsenal around a single, unblinking premise. That the fight was going to happen regardless, that surviving it wasn't the point, and that the only acceptable outcome, the only purpose their weapons needed to serve, was making absolutely certain it was the enemy who didn't walk away. Vesic was given command of a new division 6 months later, not a promotion he had sought, and not one he was entirely certain he deserved, given that it existed only because of how badly the old doctrine had failed. Its mandate was narrow and, by SK-theory standards, deeply uncomfortable, to study close-quarters engagement, a category of warfare his people had spent 1,000 years training themselves to avoid entirely. He kept, in his private quarters, the recovered blade from the Meridian Line's armory, the one his own analysts still could not agree on the correct classification for, because it did not fit any of the categories a distance-obsessed military had ever needed. It was not elegant. It was not precise. It carried no targeting assist, no guidance system, no refinement of any kind. It did exactly one thing without fail at exactly one range, and it had been more than enough to end 6 of his soldiers in under a minute. Sometimes, reviewing new intelligence from the front, human colonies still refusing to negotiate terms even as SK-theory fleets pressed further into their space, still meeting every crippled ship's boarding party with the same grim, close-range welcome, Vesic found himself wondering what kind of species built its entire military philosophy around a fight it expected to survive only sometimes, and prepared for it anyway, without flinching. He found part of his answer in a piece of recovered human data, a training document pulled from a captured outpost and translated by the linguistics division. It wasn't a manual exactly. It read more like doctrine passed down through generations, the kind of thing repeated so often it had worn smooth, like a stone handled by 1,000 hands before his own. One line had been flagged by the translators as appearing, in some form, across dozens of unrelated human military texts spanning centuries. The fight you can't avoid, you end quickly. Nothing about range. Nothing about safety. Just the assumption, stated plainly, that some battles were coming whether you wanted them or not, and the only choice left was how fast you finished them. It was such a small sentence to have built a civilization's entire arsenal around. Vesic read it a dozen times and could not decide whether it frightened him or something closer to respect. He thought, too, of Dessa, her question in the corridor about taking prisoners, the assumption baked into it that this was a war with room for pauses. She had not survived long enough to learn otherwise. He kept her name in the same file where he kept Rill's and the 5 others, not because regulation required it, but because forgetting felt like a second failure stacked on the first. He suspected the hegemony was going to find out which one it should be, whether it wanted to or not. The war was not going the way the Council's early confidence had suggested, and every month that passed made it clearer that the deciding battles would not be fought at the ranges Escatheri doctrine had spent 1,000 years perfecting. They would be fought close, in corridors and stairwells and the wreckage of ships neither side could afford to lose, on terms the humans had chosen a very long time before the first shot of this war was ever fired. And the humans, it seemed, had never once doubted they would win them there. Vesic set the blade back on its stand, turned off the light in his quarters and began, for the first time in his career, to draft a set of tactics built not around distance, but around its absence. It felt like learning to walk again after a lifetime of being told that walking was beneath him. He did not know yet whether the hegemony would survive long enough to finish learning. He knew only that the alternative, clinging to a doctrine built for an enemy who no longer existed, against one who had never fought that way at all, was no longer a choice he was willing to let stand. Somewhere beyond the reach of his window, past the dim halo of the nearest star, the war was still moving toward its next close, brutal, decisive room. Vesic intended, this time, to be ready for it.